goodness. It's a very important program. The Sea Grant agents that are on the ground in the communities are people that the community trusts to give them the information that's the most meaningful for what they need to know about. So highly applaud the Sea Grant program. I'm going to have to go fairly quickly through this. Some of it is way too technical. Some of it is way too just plain Jane. You're going to hear it again when you come to the plenary, maybe a little bit different. I just spent most of the day in the Coastal Waters Consortium all-hands meeting for our first group and then our second group. So I've heard a lot today about what did we get done, what do we want to do next time, if we had more money, what would be our wish list, what will we never be able to do because it's too expensive. So I use this title to talk about what do we know, what do we not know, and what will we never know, because the data just might not be there. The oil exposure data may have never been there. There's just lots of things that we might not know the answers to. So this is going to be a Coastal Waters Consortium-centric talk. We were the only consortium funded in the first round that was focused on marsh and nearshore ecosystems and a little bit of continental shelf. So hopefully this information is more relevant to the sorts of things that you have to do in your jobs. So where was the oil? How did it change? What are its impacts or effects? They don't necessarily all have to be impacts. Have parts of the ecosystem recovered, or some of them compromised, and what sorts of indicators of stress can we use to guide oil spill response into the future? One of the reasons I think we were funded, besides we had a great proposal, was that we also had a lot of background data. And coming into the oil spill, we don't have any background data. We don't know enough about this. We don't know enough about that. Well, our group, it actually has a lot of background data on the marsh from old projects, on the continental shelf. Ed Overton's our chemist. He's been doing chemistry in the wetlands forever. We had some early funding to get out there before the oil hit the shore and immediately after the oil hit the shore. So we didn't actually start sampling until 2011. So a lot of the oil had changed by that point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of go through this. When we first started, what did we expect? Or what was the expectation from people about how things were going to be a year after the spill, 2 years after the spill? And based on our research, what do we really know right now? So one of the things was that the oil is going to disappear rapidly. Well, what we're finding out now is that yes, some of the components weathered rapidly. And these are Ed Overton's data to show that the half-life was less than 7 days. It didn't take long for a lot of the components of the oil to disappear. And the oil that came inshore is not the same oil that was seen offshore that was also treated with dispersants. I heard the word dispersant. There's a lot of data, and I'm not going to show any of it, between us and others that show oil alone was not as toxic as Corexit alone or Corexit and oil together. So, but those are also very, you can get a wide range of information just from those types of projects. But the dispersant offshore and at the wellhead kept a lot of oil from reaching our coastal marshes. Let's see. Well, we thought, well, oil does not disappear rapidly. It's going to be there forever. Those were the two opposing views. And what we know is that the oil actually has been there for a long time, and some of it has not weathered much. And again, Ed Overton's data to show how we see the same markers that indicate oil as long as 4 years after the oil spill. And we can take you to places right now where we can find fresh oil that's been buried by sediments, and that still affects the organisms that have to burrow through those sediments or affect the food web in those areas. So some of it goes away, some of it doesn't. The biomarkers change. What it's looking like right now is that we don't have as much. That can be tied directly to Macondo oil, but we still in places have enough oil to make a difference. For instance, the person studying the insects put out caged canary only, it was a caged cricket. And when the temperature got high, the oils in the sediments would volatilize and generate vapors that would then kill all the crickets in the area, which would mean all the insects in the area as well, which would mean the food for the seaside sparrows or something else. Some of them, parts of the, some things degraded more rapidly. These are the alkanes decreasing. We also found that Hurricane Isaac resuspended and re-oiled a lot of marshes that hadn't been oiled previously. In other words, oil that might have been on within the first 10 meters of a marsh edge got pushed 100 meters into the marsh, and it's still there. The other component, so this one looks like it's going to reach background pretty soon, but we also have these aromatics that are still buried in the marshes that still seem to be affecting things. Well, anybody who'd been out during the oil spill would not assume that all the marsh was at the edge and it was evenly distributed, because the scat maps and all of our work would show that you could walk 2 feet in either direction and find more or less oil than what was in the spot that you started with. So the oil was very homogeneous in the marsh, and excuse me, but we did find out that it was moved around quite a bit and still being moved around. Let's see. So, assuming that the marsh is homogeneous, you only need a few places to sample the oil. Well, we found out we didn't really know what an oiled marsh was. We went out before the oil came in and sampled probably 150 sites in coastal Louisiana in case the oil got there. And then we went back after the oil got there and sampled found out as many as 90 of those sites that had been oiled. And so then we tried to pair them into unoiled and oiled sites so we could set up our various observations and experiments. And over time, some of those oiled sites eroded back, so we didn't have an oiled site anymore because the oil had caused the erosion, or the oil just wasn't as, the oil at Terrebonne Bay 1 unoiled was all of a sudden became higher than it was historically. And so we had a new baseline to work against to find out how things had changed after that. So it's definitely homogeneous and it changes over time. So it's difficult to decide what's an oiled marsh. A lot of physical oceanographers think that a 10-kilometer grid or a 1-kilometer grid is good enough to figure out where the oil is going. We have Dubravko Justic, who's been working on a FVCOM model that can get resolution within 18 meters, and he's going to refine it in our next work to get oil within 1 meter in this model. And he was able to predict if oil from the spill came into this area, exactly how it was entrained in the jar in the Louisiana Bight, and how it spread up into all the marshes. And his modeling was this is a little difficult to see, but this is oil. And his modeling predicted where the oil was, and it matched the scat maps. So you have to have that really fine resolution to know where the oil is going to go, which we didn't know this when the oil hit the marsh. We know it now, but this modeling component is now available in the event of future oil spills to maybe help decide where the oil is going to go given certain current conditions and climatology. This same model was used to look at possible remediation, such as river diversions. And this was the river diversion to the east of the river into Breton Sound. And that modeling showed that the water only flushed out about 20 to 25 kilometers of that estuary, and that 30 kilometers from the diversion, there was no effect of that diversion on the movement of the water back and forth into the estuary. So that particular remediation or way to deal with oil did not work in this particular instance. Some of the expectations are the marsh is just going to get better, everything's going to be fine. One of the first papers that came out said that I went to this marsh and everything was green and there was no problem. But that person didn't go back to that marsh 2 months later. And that person didn't have a control site when they went out to the other side. So you have to be careful about some of the information that's in the literature. The longer-term studies are telling us much more about what happened than some of the short-term observations. So we did see marsh erosion 3 times faster in the area of oiling in the first year, and it's continued. There's some islands that have been rapidly disappearing. And the oiling seems to go like this. The initial oiling, well, first of all, there'd be a smooth marsh edge, and then the oil would come in, and there would start to be just small areas of erosion. But this shoreline tried to seek a new continuum so that these parts that jutted out would break off, and sooner or later you would have a new oil, a new post-oil outline for that marsh. So it's not, it's in bits and pieces, and then it falls off, and we have very good microbial data that shows that certain microbes are associated with the oil and the health of the particular marsh, the organic matter in that marsh, which is what makes up most of that marsh product. Other areas, there's more mineral sources to the marsh, but definitely in Louisiana it's more organic. We've been able to measure marsh erosion at very fine detail, but we haven't been able to use some of the more historic data for oiling because there's so much variability across the study area with sea level rise, changes over time. But some of the satellite imagery work that's been done does show dropping off of erosion rates in some of these areas that had oil, but there's often not a difference between the areas that had oil or did not have oil. One of the things we're going to do in the next part is we're going to have LIDAR coverage over a large area and start mapping that up with actual measurements on the ground and with satellite imagery. Okay. So there was a lot of focus on marsh recovery, but if the marsh isn't there anymore, there's no recovery. And the erosion is permanent, and it often leads to more erosion. We have study sites that were at the marsh edge, and the marsh edge is now 8 meters. The marsh edge is 8 meters into the water, and you're now standing on the marsh edge. And these are in areas that were oiled. So we definitely have good evidence about oiling of marshes. Now, you can't dictate where the oil is going to go. You can think about different ways to contain it with booms or different things. So there's a whole technology of what works: burning, cleaning the oil off. I must notice that in your one of your slides, you have a boat up on the marsh with people trying to wipe blades of grass to get the oil off. And that's probably one of the most destructive things you can do, because you've got people stomping around in the marsh and the boat sitting on the marsh making a dent that's going to lead to erosion. So one of the best things we can get from all the science coming out of these programs is to help guide restoration methodology into the future. The impacts are going to be over after a year, but we've seen very many things that have changed over longer periods. And you also have to consider that the condition of the coast in which all of these experiments are being done is going to change. We're going to have different river discharge. We're going to have maybe droughts or floods. We're going to have sea level rise. We're going to have lots of things happening in the area besides the oil spill. And one thing we also need to be careful about is if we went out and saw something offshore in March of 2010 and went back off in August of 2010 after we saw oil on the surface, is that whatever change we see was due to the oil spill. We don't know that because we don't have the exposure data. What we can do is look at long-term data to see if the conditions we're seeing in 2010 are any different from previous years. And we've done that with phytoplankton and with hypoxia. Of course, oysters are going to be hurt. Well, no, we didn't really find that. We found that if you put them in a laboratory experiment and expose them to oil, you can see individual organismal changes. But the field studies where they were looking at spat settling on clutches of oyster shells was that they really couldn't see a difference in the oiled and the unoiled areas. And that, in fact, salinity or a virus or a parasite might affect whether the oysters were successful or not compared to whether it was just in an area that was next to an oiled marsh. Yeah, I don't think I put my second, yeah, I did put the second one in. But what we're seeing in lots of areas is that there's it may just be coincidental and it may be due to a multiple stressor that we haven't measured, is that some of the impacts that weren't that obvious until 2013. And it's uncanny how many things keep showing up in 2013 that were different. But we have to think, was the river flow different? Was the discharge different that year? What was the weather pattern? Was it really cold winter? So there are lots of other things that can affect that. Let's see. We thought we knew a lot about marshes in Louisiana. Well, we really didn't have very good state-of-the-art ways to determine processes in the marshes, like nitrification, denitrification, or greenhouse gas flux, or why is the response of nitrification different when it's near the edge versus 30 meters into the marsh, or around a pool, or where it might become flooded more often than other areas. So we've actually been finding out a whole lot more about the marshes than we ever knew, which is really good information to have for the, I hope not, next oil spill. So just for instance, this is work from Brian Roberts' group, and he found consistently that the oiled sites were lower in CO2 and N2O flux and higher in methane fluxes. And this is across 3 different areas, across all the seasons, across all the years. So some basic mechanism is taking place there that is affecting these greenhouse gas fluxes. Let's get that. We also thought, we always have known that microbes love oil, but we weren't so sure that knowing all the details of the bacterial community would be very helpful. But what we found is indeed that the genetics of that eroding marsh are very different than the genetics of a marsh that's not eroding. And we found a lot of interesting things about the erosion and soil strength and soil health by looking at the microbial communities. So the bacteria will change with presence of alkanes and PAHs. It's going to change with distance from oiling. It's going to change with the amount of oiling. The microbial communities shifted from initially to another community that is much more prone to nitrification, denitrification. So there's lots of things that we've been looking at that the genomics have been very important in. So, okay. Everybody thinks that if you oil, the fish may be affected 1 year and not in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. And so what we're finding out, as I already mentioned, is sometimes we're not seeing some of the impacts until 3 years. And the really interesting thing related to that is some of the offshore work, which we're not doing, also has this 2013 flag to it. So it's obvious that we need more long-term monitoring from all this. So is it going to be a linear response to oiling? These are just some of the insect data from the marshes in the oiled and unoiled plots. So in September 2010, very fresh oil on the marsh, and there were many more ants in 2010 in the oiled versus the unoiled. But then, if you get out there a year later, there are fewer ants compared to the reference site. And, let me see, ants, number of ants per sweep. And this is September, there's even less in the oiled. After, let me see, Hurricane Isaac came through in September of 2012, so March still, very few insects. 2013, there were, oil. Much more in the unoiled again than this one. Hurricane Isaac basically flooded all of these insects and basically wiped some of them out, so we had to go back to a new baseline to look for change over time. And now it looks like the unoiled areas may possibly be doing better than the areas that have consistently had less abundance of certain insects. So do we have recovery here? Well, we don't know exactly. And this is going to be one of the lines of investigation that we're going to continue on. But then again, we might get another spill. We might have a pipeline break. We might have another hurricane. So these experiments are definitely not controlled, and we have to try to get the best information out of them with methodology that we can use. So another one that it's not just as straightforward is the loons. We have somebody who's just joined our consortium, but he was already looking at overwintering loons in Louisiana for 2014, 13, 12, and 11. They come from Saskatchewan. They've tagged some of them. They overwinter in some of the very same sites, and so they've been collected year after year. And what these researchers found is that there was a lessening of the amount of PAHs in these loons until 2013. And then all of a sudden there's a skyrocketing of the amount of PAHs. And also they're starting to realize that the immatures may be more susceptible than the adults. And they've been analyzing, they're now going to start analyzing for some of these EPA, PAH metabolites in the blood. So, marsh fish, have they been affected? Well, you would think so. And if you put a fish in an aquarium, or you got a fish in a pool of water that had lots of oil, you're going to see metabolic differences, you're going to see lesions, you're going to see dead fish, But if you look at the overall population of these fish in the marsh, we're not actually seeing population level changes with these small marsh necktie. We're also finding out that they are fairly resident in some areas, and some of them move over great distances. So we actually know a whole lot more about how the fish in the marsh actually function than we did before we started. But the fish people are looking to see if there's other things that could be happening that we're not seeing. They're actually tagging killifish with a tag and letting them go, and then going back out a day later, 2 months later, 4 months later, and catching these things and looking at changes in growth by taking out the otoliths and looking for rings in the fish bones, fish ear bones, and looking for growth differences in whether they're in an unoiled or an oiled marsh. They're also starting to mark these otoliths by putting the fish in a chemical, then tagging them, then letting them go, and then catching them and bringing them back and taking out the otoliths. And they can tell where they marked the fish, and they now know exactly how much that fish grew in a certain amount of time. So there's some incredibly good research going on that's telling us a whole lot more about how the marshes function and the organisms with them. How does that tell you whether the seafood are safe to eat? It doesn't, but it does tell us a lot about the marsh processes and how to respond better to the next, hopefully not, oil spill. The food web has been affected. These insects feed seaside sparrows. Seaside sparrows probably fall prey to some of the larger predatory birds. And this is just getting started, but we do know that, between looking at the number of successful nested, the birds that have fledged the nests is that there's fewer in the oiled areas than the unoiled areas. And this was consistent across 2 years. And so as a summary for Coastal Waters Consortium, we just have a lot of good information now that either tells us something about the marsh, just how it's functioning, if it's functioning differently now than it did before it became exposed to the oil, and a lot more about the marsh food web and how different parts of it could be affected and how it might lead to changes in trophic layers, in other trophic levels. That's it. And don't ask me about the denitrifiers or the DNRA microbial communities. That's about as much as I know about. Yes?
I don't want to be the first. Anybody else have anything they want to? So I'm just curious if you had off the cuff recommendations for if this spill happened again, say, what should we do differently if it were to happen again, say this summer? What should we do differently in terms of our marshes?
In terms of our marshes, don't burn them. Don't stomp around in them, trying to clean them up. Sometimes that's worse than just leaving them alone. Use the booms as much as possible, but we all saw pictures of more oil inside the booms than outside the booms once the waves got, if the winds picked up and the waves picked up, then it was sloshing oil over the booms and actually holding it in next to the marsh. I would recommend if that happens, take the booms out, suck up the oil that's on the water, and then try again, start over again. That's very time consumptive and expensive, but it might keep some of that oil out of the marshes. Yeah.
Why would you recommend not burning?
That's just what I've been told. And I've actually studied an oil spill in Port Aransas where some of it was burned and some of it was not burned, and the marsh that was not burned recovered much better than the marsh that was burned. Interesting.
The erosion that you saw in the marshes that you documented, was that majority of the marshes that were showing that, or was that, you know?
Oiled marshes.
Okay, so the majority of the oil marshes that you were studying showed significant decreases, I think it's up to 30
Yeah.
meters.
Some, maybe not all of them, but we
Right.
saw dramatic losses of marshes.
And,
But which is why we tried to keep the oil out of the marshes.
right,
Not
And-
we, the command center tried to keep the oil out of the marshes.
what were the prevailing rates of erosion prior to being oil? Do you have any feel for that?
We do, and they're higher than they were historically. And I can't tell you the exact number right now. We've got a problem with marsh loss anyway. So anything we can do that would keep from losing more in the event of another oil spill would be very good.
What causes the marshes to erode the wood?
The oil is high organic material. The bacteria that degrade it start to create anaerobic conditions, which are not healthy for the marsh roots, which start to fall apart, and then the sediments and the organic matter those roots hold start to slough off. It makes an overhang. It starts to degrade underneath. It makes an overhang, and then a big chunk of it will fall off. And then in that area, and over here that happens, but then you still have some promontories that haven't eroded, but just the natural shoreline erosion after that is going to pull the whole marsh configuration back. And it's still going on in places.
Nancy, question for you. In the beginning, your talk, you mentioned the whole oil versus dispersant versus oil plus dispersant issue. And I remember that from the first conference, that some of the initial results were really starting to make that same conclusion. Do we have good data for how much dispersant made it into the coastal waters?
Well, the oil that came in had been treated with dispersants because it was emulsified and it had gone through biodegradation and solar radiation degradation and all kinds of things. So it had some dispersants in it, but I would not know the quantity of the dispersants in that oil. The dispersants were applied offshore surface slicks and at the flume at the bottom.
I think when you look at the bottom, first thing, due to that spill, the way it was dispersed, it's never been done before. We're still waiting for questions about the impact of things in the water column.
Yes, absolutely.
Before we, I advocate that the company, before we ever do that again, I'm only a state trustee, not a federal trustee, so it's using, happening outside of state territorial waters. Coming to the Natural Resource Damage Trustees in Texas, you're probably going to get pushback with deep water injection on that, because the questions have not been answered. Although most of their plans are writing it in that that's what they will do. They will blow up, deep water blow up.
Right. I would hope that a lot of the literature gets into public hands and lots of the information gets into public hands. I was going to do a study on the continental shelf looking at oiled and unoiled sediments, but I could never see the NERDA data. So I had to do some of the work inshore, and then somebody working for NERDA published a paper with all this data in it. So I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't fair.
And that's the problem.
But we have a lot of information that's still not public, and there are actually some conflicting results in the literature. I'm not surprised with that either. Some things were just reported too quickly, and if you'd gone back 2 weeks later, it would have been different.
Do y'all have any survey data about the active cleanup versus a passive cleanup?
I don't know.
Was there any?
The command center might have some of those data, and they did hire consultants to look at recovery of different types of remediation and cleanup. Jackie Michelle, with her company, they did a lot of that work.
That'd be interesting to see your 90 sites and where the active versus passive. Is that a layer, I wonder?
Well, we tried to avoid active removal of oil areas, because they were already so damaged. And one of the things we tried to do in our studies is that we have boardwalks. So we don't even walk in our study sites. And those had been trampled, you know,
Yeah.
would have been very difficult.
I mean, that would be interesting to see the passive. I mean, I know we're seeing erosion, but the erosion rate with the passive cleanup.
I think those sorts of data are available through some of the consulting companies that worked on the remediation and the recovery or not, following different types of remediation.
I know that's one thing that we push here in Texas is the fact that if you're going into these marshes, minimal is better. If you're going to do washing, low pressure, ambient
Right.
temperature,
Right.
flushing of those marsh complexes.
Right. Yeah.
The deal is there, you know, you gotta get it out the extent that you can if you want to minimize the impact. You know, it's a tough trade-off.
And what we see a year or 2 years later is probably what looks like a healthy marsh. But we're not going in there to see if there's still
Here we go.
oil buried in anaerobic sediments. We can't do everything. And what would you do? I mean, how do you remediate it? Other than mitigation, other things. Okay, thank you all.
Okay, that was perfect. So happy about that presentation. If you guys would again, please take a few minutes. There's an evaluation form in your folders. Just a little bit of feedback. And Nancy, we do have a question in there about your presentation specifically, so if you want that feedback, we'll share that with you later too. And then again, we hope to see you on Thursday. Free lunch, a lot more discussion. We started a really great discussion now. Hold on to those thoughts and bring them back to us on Thursday.
Can you tell us where and when?
Yes, it's on the agenda as well in your folder, but it will be on the 24th floor in the Royal Suite from 12 to 2. Now, the Royal Suite, yes.
It's fancy.
It's got a great view. I was up there earlier today. It's really nice. But if you go across the hall to where your registration and check-in area is, there's an elevator, and you can take that to the 24th floor that way. And that's the only way I know how to get that. I don't know if there's another way to access it. But again, near the registration booth, there's an elevator. And anybody around here can direct you in that location as well. So Royal Suite, 12 to 2 on Thursday. We hope to see you guys there.
Don't forget to do your homework.
Take as many notes as you can. Don't stress yourselves out over it, of course, but it's just to help you guys come back to us with some topics that we can take notes on and bring back to our offices.
I would add too that any questions that you have that even if we can't answer it, we meaning the collective, we research outreach awesome people, write it down anyway, because we also have access to the Gone program too, so we will get the answer for you if you have a question.
Any questions right now that we can, as far as not the science so much, but
That's right.
the workshops and the Grid C presentation on Thursday. Does anybody need to order a lunch that didn't order one already? Do you want to eat? Going once? Yes? Okay. All right, I'll come see you in a second. Thank you. I will. What's that you don't remember?
Yeah.
I'll let you know. I have a list. I have a master list. If you could check for George.
So many events.
If you want to just hand me your evaluation form as you leave, or make a pile by the door, I can get them too.